Well, I've got about 6:59, so I would like to go ahead and kick this off. I'm Mike Staten. I'm a soybean educator here in Allegan County, but I cover the whole state of Michigan. And I want to welcome you to the second session of our Field Crops Virtual Breakfast. And this is a team effort for the whole Field Crops team puts this together. And we want to welcome you. And we've got some excellent presentations this morning. Some housekeeping things, though. First thing is we want you to mute yourself during the presentations. That's very important, keeps things flowing well. Then we also, for the RUP credits, we need you to sign in with your first and last name, both. And to do this, you click on the participant list, find your name and hover over it. Then you click More, and then rename. And then the last thing I want to talk about is questions. We really want to encourage questions from all of the participants. And there's two ways of doing that. The first way, while the presentations are actually running, we would like you to enter those in the chat box, type those into the chat box. Then during our question and answer period, after both presentations have been given, we will take questions using the microphones. So we'll do that both ways. This is an important slide. The graphic on the right just says basically everything that MSU does is available to everyone. And now the box on the right is really important because we do collect demographic data. So the collection of demographic data from program participants is an important and mandated aspect of all Michigan State University Extension programming. This is totally voluntary, and the information that you provide will not be used in any way to identify you personally, but rather as an anonymous member that participated in this program. Following the RUP and CCA credits, we're going to have a poll, and we would ask that you take a moment to answer the questions in the poll. We really appreciate it. Thank you. With that, I'd like to introduce our first presenter for the day, and Dr. Kurt Steinke. He is an associate professor in soil fertility and nutrient management, and Kurt is going to help us make some important decisions this spring regarding our fertility applications. Kurt, I'm going to stop sharing. Whoop, all right, and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Does everything look okay on the screen?
It does.
All right, fantastic. So thank you everybody for being here this morning. Hopefully everyone has a cup of coffee and is ready to go here. We're going to go over, I got 3 or 4 or 5 different things I want to touch on quick, considering where we are at in the growing season and some of the current circumstances that we are all experiencing. First thing, you look at March Madness, right? March Madness ended with basketball, I guess, last Monday or about 3 days ago. But if you look at fertilizer pricing, the madness will continue into April, and who knows how long. You know, some of these price spikes do not appear to be temporary, as in maybe a month or 2 or a couple months. We've talked a lot about this all fall and winter. So I just took some recent pricing that I got within the last week or so, and you can see these are all cash bulk prices. Urea 28, around $1.07, $1.08. Per pound, and hydrous about 92 cents, MAP DAP a little over $1, and potash about 74, 75 cents a pound. So, you know, a couple things here. These prices are probably, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, about 10 to 15 cents above what they were late fall, maybe Halloween, Thanksgiving into winter, some of the winter meetings. So, you know, I've gone over time and time again, many events have influenced these prices, and fertilizer prices were high prior to some of the current world events going on, right? So a lot of these spikes occurred last fall with a lot of the spikes in energy prices. So the volatile energy market's going to create some fluctuations in fertilizer pricing. So big key point here is this isn't just a circumstance of current events. I'm getting a lot of media inquiries based on this, but these prices were high going into fall and winter, and now they've gone up again about another 10 or 15 cents to the pound. You know, and why, right? And I want to throw this in there because I always get this question. We always tend to forget from time to time that fertilizer doesn't come from the store. Fertilizer doesn't come from a bag. It's not birthed in a bag, right? Much of it's produced or mined. And so I just wanted to throw this up there, looking at those two main ingredients in the top right and top left-hand corners. You start looking, it's a very energy intensive process to produce nitrogen with both natural gas, and then breaking this triple bond of nitrogen from the air takes a lot of energy. And then you can see the different ways that some of the end solutions, urea and anhydrous and UAN, are then produced. But it does take energy to produce this. And again, as those energy markets become volatile, you'll see some of these price spikes fluctuate up and down. So enough about that. First thing I want to talk about wheat. You know, probably the weather this week has forced many of us, unfortunately, to sit inside and look outside. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? With regards to wheat, you know, the question I get oftentimes is with green up applications, where are we at? What should we do? Are we too late? And I will direct everybody to look at their local weather station nearby and look at where those soil temperatures are, right? So I just looked at this, I believe Tuesday evening or Wednesday morning, looking at minimum soil temperatures about at that 2-inch depth. And we're still getting down to, you can see Lansing about 37, up towards the thumb, Ridgeville 37, down southwest 39. You start going up towards Kalkaska, 32. You get up into the UP, 32 degrees. And some of those coarse textured sandy soils, you can see right there, like around that Grant area in the western part of the state. Some of those the sandy mounds and hills, you know, they did hit 50 degrees for a short period of time, then drop. So, you know, spring green up is dictated by soil temperatures, right? Until those soil temperatures start gaining, we're not going to get sufficient green up. Now, it looks like, you know, Jeff will probably talk a little bit more about this coming up over the weekend and into early next week. We'll warm up a little bit for hopefully a short time period. But you can see, I noticed over the last couple of days that wheat is starting to change form, right? You can see it's starting to get more vertical, starting to get a little bit more upright, starting to get a little bit more erect. That's where we're starting to hit that green up phase. So have we missed the window or anything with green up? Absolutely not. Now, for those of us that might have planted a little bit later last fall, you might want to get your on a little bit earlier. But if the wheat's looking okay, no, you have not missed your green up window or your opportunity. And this brings up a great question about freeze ups versus green ups, right? I always get this question. There's a difference. When you talk about green up applications, we're usually talking about that Feeks 4, Feeks 5 growth stage, where your freeze up is more as, you know, that last week or two that ground is frozen, that last frost that's in the ground, you can get on and get your N on in that manner. So there is a pretty big difference between those two. So we have a project going on where we did freeze up applications this year. That occurred on about March 6th. Now, the big thing to think about is since March 6th, we got about 2.7 inches of rain. That's not including what we got yesterday. So you probably bump that up to about 3.2, 3.3. We got more rain coming today, tomorrow, early next week. So that can really influence your in-season N application timing when you talk about that freeze up versus green up N application. If you go with that freeze up application, the likelihood of seeing a response to maybe a later season N application in wheat goes up a little bit, right? And why? Because you have more frequent and loss conditions. Those freeze up applications this year might get, you know, an extra 3.5, maybe 4 inches of rain versus your conventional green up N application. So that's probably one of the big things to remember and pay attention to moving forward. I threw this picture in there. I got a study going on with Marty Chilvers and Field Crops Pathology, looking at some intensive wheat management. And, you know, can you determine which plots receive starter fertilizer? Absolutely. I took this last fall with the picture on the left. And then, you know, this is one of those studies that even in the middle of winter, you can go out and see that treatment effect sticking around. So everything that you see there had a pre-plant nitrate test that was below 10 parts per million. I think this year was more around 3 or 4 ppm. And so again, that's one of the key indicators to starter fertilizer on wheat. But what a dramatic response that we see there. But that is not the only indicator for whether you see a response to autumn nutrient management on winter wheat. So we've had a study going on the last couple of years looking at what is one thing I can do on winter wheat in the autumn to make sure it's set to do well come springtime, right? That start right to finish well concept. So we actually looked at about 7 or 8 different treatments down the left-hand side of this table that you can see there. And then we looked at it both in early plant and late plant scenario. And our early plant this last year was about September 21. Our late plant was about October 15th. And the big driving home point you want to remember here is when you look at that late planting date, and it's not all that late, it's October 15th, nothing showed a significant effect. You look at that early planting date, and yes, we start to see things that showed a significant result, right? A little bit with that 25 units of N in the autumn, a lot more with that starter fertilizer that had N and S combination. S alone, you can see here, didn't do the trick. Potash alone didn't do a whole heck of a lot. And so the big point here is it's a mixture of both. You have to look at that pre-plant soil test, and in many cases, you have to have an actively growing root system to uptake whatever nutrient gets applied in the autumn. If you plant later, and like I said, October 15th isn't all that late. We just didn't get the growing degree days last year to get that wheat actively growing at that point in the season, and it just couldn't uptake that nutrient that got applied. Thus, it couldn't respond to that nutrient application. So it's a combination of both. Look at that pre-plant soil test, and in many cases, we have to have that timely planted wheat in the fall to uptake that specific nutrient. One thing I wanted to switch gears here to a little bit is P and K. Again, I talked a little bit about this during some of the webinars this last winter. You know, with the current economic climate, that build up and maintain philosophy is structured for these economic conditions, right? So if you look at that tri-state approach, you want to look at that fertilizer gets applied to soils with optimal soil test is designed to maintain that soil test at those optimal levels. Adding fertilizer may increase yield below the critical level. The further you are below that critical level, the more likely you are to see a response, and that larger that response will be. Right. And so for 2022, one of the things you want to think about is consider P and K in those fields that are below critical. And where you are above critical, you want to use what you have accumulated, right? Treat the soil like a bank. Instead of making a deposit with a nutrient application every year, this might be one of those years you make a withdrawal. So really focus on those below critical level fields. And if you're sufficient, you might be just fine not applying P or K this growing season. Now, the question we get is how much will your soil test levels change over time? Through a couple examples up here. Now, these are average drawdown rates. They will vary by buffer capacity. If you're a coarse textured sand and poorly buffered, or a finely textured clay or clay loam and more highly buffered, it will switch a little bit. But you can see 180 bushel corn grain might drop that soil potassium test by about 3 ppm, soybean grain about 6, 35-ton sugar beet production about 19, and about 30 hundredweight dry bean production about 4. So there's really a pretty good difference based on crop rotation. So that would be one thing to think about. And we don't know where these current prices are going to be, 6 months from now. So, we've dealt with these for about a year. If this goes on for about 2 years, that's when we really may start to see an impact, because I know a lot of you might apply P and K prior to something like corn and have that carry through to something like soybean production. You look at soil test levels. If you don't add phosphorus this year, how much they may adjust. Same parameters you can see there: 180 bushel corn grain, about 3 part per million drop. Soybean, about 3, beets 4, and dry beans about 2, given those specific yield parameters. So again, it's a good rule of thumb to think about. Now, I was working with some data with the folks at KBS a couple weeks back. And we have one of our treatments in some of the long-term trials down there, one of the organic treatments that hasn't received phos fertilizer in just over 30 years. And the reason why I want to throw this up there, you can look starting about 1994, 1995, soil test levels were just shy of 40 parts per million. And it took nearly 30 plus years to get them down to those critical levels of where we're at now at about 15 parts per million. Right. And so I want to emphasize that, because we know about, 2/3 of Michigan soils are high or very high in soil test phosphorus. It takes time to draw that down. Right. So if you're sitting there in this 40 to 50 or higher range, you should be perfectly fine this next growing season and for several growing seasons not applying phosphorus fertilizer, right? Take some time to draw that down over time. So I wanted to throw that up there. A couple of points to remember with regards to P&K, that build and maintain approach is structured for the current economic climate that we are experiencing. It's okay not to apply if that soil test doesn't warrant an application. Much of our fertilizer savings this year will come in P&K, not necessarily N. I'll get into that in a second. And especially on something like corn and wheat, try not to forget the sulfur. I wanted to throw one slide up there. I'm on this regional group committee, about a 12-state committee, the NCR 103 committee, that we deal with non-traditional soil amendments and growth stimulants. We have a digital compendium dealing with all sorts of products. Biologicals, different soil amendments, different nutrients, etc. There's a lot of product being pushed out there right now that may or may not have an impact in the field, right? And so I urge you to check out a compendium like we have here. This has all sorts of data from probably the last 30, 40 years listed in there. And some of those products you will see listed in there. Last thing I want to hit on here is corn and nitrogen for this coming growing season. And I want to throw some caution out there if you're utilizing your 2021 corn yields to base your 2022 corn N program. And why? 2021 was a great corn year across much of the state, right? So we know productive soils can provide a fairly large portion or fraction of your corn N requirements. In continuous corn, it's about 50 to 60%. And corn following soybean, it's about 60 to 70%. So remember, towards the end of last growing season, what did we have? We had moisture. We never really dried out. You can see that through the harvest ruts through the field right now. And we had heat units, right? It was warm in August and September, and we had sufficient moisture. We mineralized a little bit more N towards the end of the season than we otherwise normally would. And how much so? You know, our estimates are probably anywhere between about 40 and 60 pounds of N. So you look at some of the corn N response trial data that we saw this last year. Here's one site. What really sticks out going from 0 to 300 pounds is we received about 141 bushel corn without applying a drop of N, right? And you push this up to about 1,500 units, and we had 200 bushel corn with 100 units of N. Completely different location, same response, 0 to 60 units of N, 140 to 180 bushel corn. Got all the way up to about 280, 285 with 180 units of N. And a third location, same thing, right? And so we had a little bit more N in that system towards the end of that season last year to kind of fill out and finish off some of that corn grain towards the end of the season. These 0 N plots, typically in a normal growing season where we don't get that slug towards the end of the season, will probably be anywhere between about 85 and 110 bushels to the acre. This year, they were closer to that 130 to 140. All right. And so that really helped finish off the corn crop last year. So just remember that as we go into this next growing season as to why we had some fairly productive corn yields last year. And with that being said, I just updated the corn N rate calculator for Michigan. The 7-state calculator was updated within the last couple of weeks. So you can see this would be our 2022 MRTN suggested N rates for corn. We updated quite a few sites this year, and so everything bumped up a little bit. Everything's up about 5-7 pounds from what it was previously. You can see with current corn prices and current N prices, we're in this about 0.15 N to corn price ratio. And I will emphasize with everybody again, all these data are based on corn N response trial data. They are not simply based on the price of N and price of corn. The price of N and the price of corn will fluctuate what end of that optimal zone we should apply with regards to an application, but they are all based on corn N response data. And if you don't use economics to guide your N applications on corn, typically go with that 0.05 ratio, and those tend to be our non-limiting N rates. And remember, these are suggestions. This is a pre-season N model, right? So if we get 8 inches of rain in June, or we get 0 rain like we saw last year in May and June, your in-season N application will probably adjust to some extent, right? So it's a pre-season model to get you going, get you started, and it's a good rule of thumb or guide to guide you moving forward. So with that being said, want to wrap up on time here. I will stick around for the remainder of the hour to answer any questions, concerns. But with that, I thank you for your time this morning. As always, if there are any questions, concerns, feel free to reach out. We got most of our data posted on the website that you see listed there. My email's listed, and I will stop sharing and hand it over to Mike and or Jeff.
Excellent presentation, Kurt. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. You stayed right on time. Actually saved us a little bit of time. So thank you for attending. We really appreciate it. We do have a question and answer period coming up, though. So please, if you have questions, either type them into the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question through the microphone. And so if you want to follow up, let's say you want to follow up on either one of these presentations, you can do this in several different ways. You can go to Twitter. You can go to Apple Podcast, Spotify, or follow us on Facebook, or you can also, it'll be loaded down on the Field Crops website. And the advantage of going to the website is there's a lot of really good information there in addition to the virtual breakfast. So be sure to navigate around that site once you're there. Kurt, there was a couple of questions that were entered into the chat. If you could, because we do have several folks that are joining by phone, if you could answer those orally, that would really be good. Maybe repeat the question and give us your answer.
Sure thing, Mike. I see one came in looking at what are the maintenance ranges for phos and potassium for corn and soybean. And if some of those K levels are in the middle of the range, is it okay not to apply potash this spring? So couple things to remember with regards to phosphorus. We're looking at that sufficiency zone maintenance range, about 20 to 40 parts per million. On the Malik scale, about 15 to 30 parts per million on the Bray scale. So make sure you look at what test you got from whatever lab provides your analyses. On the potassium side, potash side, we're looking at those coarse textured sandy soils, which we consider CECs of 5 and below. Our critical level of 100, maintenance 100 to 130, that zone. On those finer textured soils above a CEC of 5, we're talking a critical level of 120 parts per million. And then that maintenance zone, sufficiency zone, extends up from 120 up to about 170 parts per million. So, you know, if you're in the middle part of those zones, absolutely, more likely than not, you will be just fine this coming growing season. Now, obviously, some of that response also depends on the weather, and you can see how variable it is based on the weather report we just received from Jeff. So, you know, it's one of those things. Look at where prices are at. This might not be the year. Based on that price point to apply P/K fertilizer, right? We talked about that a lot all winter. So take a look at that soil test report. I gave a couple examples on how far some of those soil test levels may draw down. But it's one of those things, if prices aren't going to adjust here over the short term, you know, going into fall, a lot of you may have you know, this last fall, a lot of you may have already pre-purchased some of that product right before some of these price spikes. That may not be the case this next fall. So really look at that 4-year crop rotation, 3-year crop rotation, whatever you're on. And there's a couple different crops in there that tend to draw out a little bit more potassium than others. You know, one of those is sugar beets. So, you know, you got to kind of start planning ahead a little bit on when you might apply potash. But if you're in that 150 plus zone, well above, you probably should be just fine this year not applying something like potash. And I threw that example up there of phosphorus drawdown too. It takes a while, right? Mm-hmm. I know oftentimes we think if we don't apply, you know, our conventional MAP or DAP application this year, that all of a sudden soil test levels are going to fall off a cliff, but it really depends on where you're starting at. Right. So if you're near critical, yes, they can fall below critical quite quickly. And the lower you go, the harder it is to bring them up. But if you're sitting in this 40 plus range, 50 plus range, more likely than not, you will be just fine not applying something like phosphorus this year. Now, the question comes, should you or should you not use something like starter fertilizer, right? And oftentimes at those sufficient soil test levels, you know, that P and or K in starter might provide a early season biomass response, but it oftentimes will not translate to a yield response. So when you look at those critical levels, you know, the chance of seeing a yield response, that's what that soil test level and report is based on. It's the likelihood of seeing a yield response, not necessarily based on the likelihood of seeing a plant biomass response. So there's a difference between those two.
Excellent, Kurt. I really appreciate you taking the time with that. So in summary, is it really important for growers to try not to let their soil test levels, whether it's P or K, fall below those critical levels if at all possible? Or what do you think for the long-term management? Should we try to keep them above critical?
Yeah, so you start talking about the long-term scale, and it's relative, right? Some people long-term is 1 to 2 years, and some people long-term is probably the next 10 years plus, right? But the thing to remember is it takes time to bring these levels back up, right? So if you start getting close to critical and fall below critical, you can't just go out with a singular application all of a sudden and say, okay, I'm fine. Both those processes for P and K buildup are anywhere from about 2 to 4 year processes, right? And it'll take longer the lower that level gets. The closer you get to critical and the farther you fall below critical, the longer it will take to build those up past and above critical once again. And so again, that's what I would use to be the deciding factor moving forward. The closer they get to critical and fall below critical, the longer it does take to build those back up above critical.
Thank you, Kurt. Jeff, this looks like a question for you. It's, are the plains abnormally dry compared to the average, or is this a result of the past year?
It's probably some of all the above. They definitely, they're dry going back into last year, but they've also had a drier than normal winter. And as I mentioned, we're still in a La Nina pattern, and the longer term outlooks do not suggest a lot of relief in terms of precipitation, especially in the southern plains. But this is a combination of both longer term dryness plus drier than normal conditions in the recent past.
I'm summarizing, but Mark says he thanks you for your expertise, but he says you might not want to quit your day job and hit the motivational speaker circuit.
So noted. Not the first time. Question.
Another question. This is just for Phil. Hopefully you've done this. Can you post the email address for the RUP credits again in the post? You've probably done that in the chat.
All set, Mike.
All right, good. That looks like there's another question here. Is there a short explanation of the differences between the two soil test standards? If so, what is it and why the change? And I assume this is probably between malic and ammonium acetate for potassium and malic and Bray P1 for phosphorus.
Yep, that's a great question. So we switched the standards with the new tri-state revision, I guess 2 years ago now, back in 2020. And the big driver there was a lot of the private labs use those extractants. And the reason they do is they can extract more than one nutrient, right? So when you look at something like Bray P, you only get phosphorus. When you look at malic P, you can get more than just phosphorus. You get multiple nutrients. So it's kind of an efficiency standard. You get more bang for your buck. But a lot of us have those numbers ingrained in our head. Bray P is 15 part per million critical level for corn and soybean. So it takes a while to adjust, right? And so probably moving forward, as hopefully I can find time to revise some of those statewide nutrient bulletins, I'll probably put both in there, because some of us, will probably always stick with that Bray number, and some of us will switch to that malic number, but they are interrelated. So if you ever get confused, we have a bulletin posted on soil.msu.edu that lets you convert from Bray to malic and malic to Bray, and from ammonium acetate to malic K, and from malic K back to ammonium acetate.
Very good, Kurt. And I want to let you know too, because I've been concerned about this also, Clay, and I called some of the private labs in Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan to find out how they are actually reporting their P and K. And the bulk of them are actually reporting, not only extracting with malic 3, but reporting them as malic 3 numbers. So most of the labs are doing that. Brookside, Spectrum, those are all reported as malic. The one example that I found that wasn't was actually Great Lakes, A&L Great Lakes. Most of their reports are reported as Bray 1 or ammonium acetate, but you can, as a client, you can request it either way from all of these labs. You can request it to be adjusted the other way if you want as an individual client. But most labs, like Kurt said, are not only extracting with those with Malic, but they're reporting that way as well. Great Lakes, A&L Great Lakes is the exception, and you can request them to be reported in Malic 3 if you want. So really good question.
And another thought there, Mike, is some of those labs report the Bray equivalent number. So oftentimes they might extract in Malic and then convert it to Bray because we know what that Bray number is. So if you look at that lab report, you'll see up there whether it says Malic, Malic 3P, Malic 3K, AA, or Bray.
Yep, exactly. And I think that's what A&L does, Kurt, is they're reporting as an equivalent. So there is another question. So this is a wheat question, Kurt. It's what are your thoughts on the probability of yield response to split N applications this year if we do have this above normal precipitation for wheat?
That too is another great question. So many years we do not see responses to split N applications on wheat. We really have to have a wet April is usually the month to drive that probability of yield response to those split N applications. So there's probably two questions here. One would be if you do split apply N, how early was your first application, right? So if it was more of that freeze up, you got on and you spun on urea when the ground was still frozen, something like that. When did that occur and how much rain will we get in between that time and when wheat really starts cranking here and really starts greening up, hitting Feeks 4, Feeks 5 and shooting upwards. So you can see in our example, our freeze ups already this year go back about a month or so. We're looking at 3+ inches. We got more rain coming. So that could be the difference. Now, those of you that were well tillered into the fall, hold on and wait till green up occurs. The last time we saw a significant yield response to split N application on wheat, if my memory serves me correctly here, was probably all the way back to about 2013. All right. And that year we had, I believe, about 8.5 inches of rain in April. All right. So we're not at that point yet. Right. And so it would take a really wet condition. I think a couple of years back, we had an April with about 5.2 or 5.3 inches here in the Lansing area. And still that wasn't wet enough to drive a yield response to split applied N on wheat. So you really have to have a significantly wet April. And if you can't go out and plant today, we always think it's probably too wet. But it depends on how far above that normal we actually get. So there's a couple different angles to that question. One, again, how early was your first application? And then the second one, how wet do we actually stay and remain here for the remainder of the month of April?
Excellent. Eric Anderson asks about the MSU soil testing lab, Kurt. He's stating that we do use the Bray P1 for phosphorus and the ammonium acetate for potassium in our lab, and we report them in those values. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, that is correct.
Do we have the ability of converting those over? If we were to call the MSU lab, could we ask them to be reported as Malic 3 equivalents? Or
I don't know if on the computer program we can do that, but either myself or John Dahl have the capability through, for example, that bulletin that we have posted on our site to convert those over. So if you do want them converted, I highly suggest you looking at that bulletin. It's a straight equation that you can look at to convert that Bray to Malic.
Kurt, along those lines, we did have feedback where they would like you to list the URL for your website in the chat, if you would. They're interested in that publication.
Not a problem. I will do.
That's great. I believe that's all the questions. I really appreciate. Oh, I've got one for Jeff. Jeff, you mentioned April. Is the rest of April is looking, maybe cooler and wetter. And what about May? What happens as we, at the end of that 3 to 4 week period, what happens as we get in the month of May? What's the projection?
Right now, it's a little bit like that 3 to 4 week outlook I showed. Are certainly for temperatures to go back up to at least normal to maybe above normal, but also a continuation of the near to above normal precipitation. So that's where we've been for the last couple of months, looking at that long lead, and it's the above normal precipitation is something we commonly see here in the Great Lakes with La Nina events, where not always, but more often than not, we do see above normal precip totals, and that is a reflection of again continuing. The La Nina is not expected now to end up until probably the middle of summer. So that's basically similar direction, but warmer temperatures.
Good, thank you. Any further questions? Well, hearing none, I really want to thank everyone for joining us again today. It was an excellent session. A lot of good information, a lot of good questions were answered. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week.